The morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of the grand bedroom at Highgrove House. Charles stirred in his sleep, his arm reaching across the vast bed only to find empty space where his wife should have been. The silk sheets were cold, indicating Camilla had been gone for some time. This had become a familiar pattern over the past few months, but Charles had chosen to ignore the growing distance between them. Downstairs, the sound of hushed phone conversations drifted from Camilla's private study. Charles paused at the top of the ornate staircase, listening to the melodic tone of his wife's voice. There was something different about it, a warmth and intimacy he hadn't heard directed toward him in years. The conversation was punctuated by soft laughter, the kind that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Their marriage had always been complicated. After years of public scrutiny, divorces, and the tragic loss of Diana, Charles and Camilla had finally been able to marry in 2005. The world had watched, some with acceptance, others with lingering disapproval. But they had weathered those storms together, finding solace in their shared history and deep understanding of each other's complexities. Charles descended the stairs slowly, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The conversation from the study ceased abruptly as he approached. When he entered the room, Camilla was seated at her antique writing desk, her phone face down beside a stack of correspondence. Her cheeks were flushed, and there was a brightness in her eyes that he hadn't seen in months. "Good morning, darling," she said, her voice carrying a note of forced casualness. "I was just handling some charity business. You know how these organizations can be, always needing immediate attention for something or other." Charles studied his wife's face, noting the way she avoided his direct gaze. Camilla had always been an accomplished woman, juggling numerous charitable commitments and royal duties with grace. But something felt different about this morning. The energy in the room seemed charged with secrets. "Which charity?" Charles asked, settling into the leather armchair across from her desk. The morning light revealed the fine lines around Camilla's eyes, testament to their shared years and experiences. She was still beautiful to him, still the woman who had captured his heart decades ago when they were both young, and the world seemed full of possibilities. "The Literacy Foundation," she replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. "They're organizing a new reading program for underprivileged children. Quite exciting, actually. We're hoping to launch it next month." Charles nodded, accepting the explanation even as something nagged at him. Camilla's work with literacy programs was indeed close to her heart. It was one of the things he admired most about her. Her genuine passion for helping others learn to read had always impressed him. Perhaps he was being paranoid, reading meanings into innocent situations. The rest of the morning proceeded normally. They shared breakfast in the sunroom, discussing the day's schedule and upcoming engagements. Charles had meetings with his private secretary about environmental initiatives, while Camilla had fittings for upcoming royal appearances. The conversation was polite, even warm, but Charles couldn't shake the feeling that his wife was somewhere else entirely, her mind occupied with thoughts she wasn't sharing. After breakfast, Charles retreated to his study to review correspondence and prepare for his afternoon meetings. Through his window, he could see Camilla in the garden, walking among her beloved roses with her phone pressed to her ear. Even from a distance, he could see the animation in her gestures, the way she moved with a lightness that had been absent for so long. The pattern continued over the following days. Mysterious phone calls that ended when Charles appeared. Text messages that made Camilla smile in ways that used to be reserved for him. Long absences explained away as charity work or shopping trips with friends. Each incident was perfectly reasonable on its own, but together they formed a picture that Charles was reluctant to examine too closely. Their social circle began to notice the subtle changes too. At a dinner party hosted by close friends, Charles observed how Camilla's attention seemed divided. She would drift into private thoughts mid-conversation, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. When asked about her distraction, she would laugh and blame it on planning for upcoming royal tours or worrying about one of her patronages. The couple's longtime friends, Lord and Lady Ashworth, exchanged concerned glances across the dinner table. They had known both Charles and Camilla for decades, had witnessed the evolution of their relationship from its complicated beginnings to their eventual marriage. The easy intimacy and shared understanding that had always characterized the couple seemed strained, replaced by polite conversations and careful distances. "You seem a bit distant tonight, my dear," Lady Ashworth mentioned to Camilla during a quiet moment on the terrace. "Everything quite all right?" Camilla's response was quick and bright, perhaps too bright. "Oh, everything's wonderful. Just tired from all the traveling lately. You know how it is. The schedules get more demanding every year. But Lady Ashworth, wise from years of friendship and observation, wasn't entirely convinced. There was something different about Camilla's energy, a kind of restless excitement that seemed at odds with fatigue. It was the energy of someone with a secret, someone living a parallel life that brought unexpected joy. Charles, meanwhile, threw himself into his work with renewed intensity. His environmental initiatives, his architectural interests, his various patronages, all received increased attention as he tried to fill the growing void in his personal life. His staff noticed the change, commenting privately about how the prince seemed to be working longer hours, accepting more engagements, staying busy in ways that suggested avoidance rather than enthusiasm. The irony wasn't lost on Charles. Here he was, finally, married to the woman he had loved for most of his adult life, the woman for whom he had endured decades of scandal and criticism, and yet he felt more alone than ever. The easy companionship they had shared, the sense of being truly understood and accepted, seemed to be slipping away like sand through his fingers. During quiet evenings at home, Charles would catch Camilla staring out the window with a dreamy expression, her mind clearly elsewhere. When he would try to engage her in conversation about their shared interests, their love of gardening, their passion for historic preservation, their commitment to various causes, her responses felt automatic, as if she were going through familiar motions while her heart was engaged elsewhere. The most painful moments came during their traditional evening routine. For years, they had ended each day with tea in the library, sharing the day's experiences and planning for tomorrow. These conversations had been the foundation of their relationship, honest, intimate discussions about everything from royal duties to personal hopes and fears. Now, even these sacred moments felt hollow. Camilla would check her phone frequently during their tea time, claiming to be monitoring urgent charity business or staying updated on family matters. The device seemed to pulse with importance, commanding her attention in ways that Charles's presence no longer could. When pressed about specific details of her various commitments, she would provide vague answers that satisfied the surface requirements of conversation while revealing nothing of substance. Charles found himself lying awake at night, listening to the sound of Camilla's breathing beside him and wondering when they had become strangers sharing a bed. The woman who had once known his thoughts before he voiced them, who could make him laugh with a single glance across a crowded room, now felt as distant as the stars visible through their bedroom window. The breaking point came on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning. Charles had an early meeting canceled and decided to surprise Camilla with breakfast in bed, something they used to do regularly during the early days of their marriage. He prepared her favorite, fresh strawberries with cream, perfectly brewed Earl Grey tea, and toast with the homemade marmalade from their own orangery. Carrying the tray upstairs, Charles felt a flutter of hope. Perhaps this small gesture could begin to bridge the growing distance between them. Maybe they just needed to make more effort to nurture the intimacy that had once felt so natural and effortless. But, as he approached their bedroom, he heard Camilla's voice through the slightly open door. She was on the phone again, but this conversation was different from the charity calls and family discussions he had overheard before. Her voice carried an intimacy and vulnerability that made his steps falter. "I know, darling," she was saying, her voice soft and full of emotion. "I think about last weekend constantly. It was perfect, absolutely perfect. I never imagined I could feel this way again, especially at this stage of my life." Charles stood frozen in the hallway, the breakfast tray growing heavy in his hands. The tone of Camilla's voice, the endearments, the reference to last weekend, all of it painted a picture he had been desperately trying to avoid seeing. "No, he doesn't suspect anything," Camilla continued, unaware that her husband was mere feet away. "Charles has been so absorbed in his work lately, and I've been careful about the timing of our calls. He trusts me completely, which makes this both easier and more difficult, if you know what I mean." The breakfast tray slipped from Charles's numb fingers, crashing to the floor in a symphony of breaking china and spilled tea. The sound echoed through the hallway like a gunshot, announcing his presence and bringing Camilla's conversation to an abrupt halt. "I have to go," he heard her say quickly. "Something's happened. I'll call you later." Charles stared down at the mess at his feet, broken pieces of their finest china scattered among strawberries and pools of cooling tea. It seemed like a metaphor for something, though his mind was too shocked to process exactly what. The physical wreckage somehow seemed less devastating than the emotional devastation he had just witnessed. "Charles," Camilla's voice called from the bedroom, carefully controlled but tinged with concern. "Is everything all right? I heard a crash." For a long moment, Charles couldn't move or speak. The hallway seemed to spin around him as the implications of what he had overheard began to sink in. His wife, his companion of decades, the woman he had risked everything to marry, was having an affair. The realization hit him like a physical blow, making it difficult to breathe. "I'm fine," he managed to call back, though nothing could have been further from the truth. "Just drop the breakfast tray. Nothing that can't be cleaned up." But even as he said the words, Charles wondered if that was true. Some breakages were beyond repair, some messes too complicated for simple cleaning. As he knelt among the shards of broken china, carefully picking up the pieces while trying not to cut himself, he couldn't help but wonder if his marriage had just suffered the same fate as the elegant breakfast service, shattered beyond recognition, with sharp edges capable of inflicting even more damage to anyone who tried to put it back together. The sound of Camilla's footsteps approaching made him look up. She appeared in the doorway wearing her silk robe, her hair slightly disheveled from sleep, looking concerned and beautiful and guilty all at once. In her hand, she still held the phone that had just delivered such devastating news to his world. "Oh, Charles," she said, immediately kneeling beside him to help gather the broken pieces. "What happened? You're usually so careful with the china." As they knelt together among the wreckage, Charles studied his wife's face, searching for signs of the woman who had just been speaking so intimately to another man. She looked like the same Camilla he had loved for decades, but everything felt different now. Every expression seemed potentially false, every word possibly calculated. "I wanted to surprise you with breakfast in bed," Charles said quietly, his voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside him. "Like we used to do." Something flickered across Camilla's face. Guilt, sadness, regret, he couldn't tell which. For a moment, she looked as if she might say something significant, might bridge the chasm that had just opened between them. But the moment passed, and instead she simply smiled and thanked him for the thoughtful gesture. As they cleaned up the mess together, working in a silence that felt loaded with unspoken truths, Charles realized that this was a turning point. The accidental eavesdropping had shattered more than just a breakfast service. It had broken the careful illusion that had been holding their marriage together. Now he faced an impossible choice: confront the truth he had discovered and risk losing everything, or pretend he had heard nothing and continue living a lie. Either path seemed to lead to destruction, but the status quo was no longer an option. The breakfast tray had fallen, the china was broken, and there was no going back to the way things were just moments before. As Camilla disposed of the last broken pieces, and Charles mopped up the spilled tea, neither spoke about the obvious question hanging in the air: what happens now? The question would demand an answer soon enough, but for this moment, they simply cleaned up the mess together, both knowing that some damage couldn't be repaired with soap and water. The days following the breakfast incident passed in a strange, suspended reality. Charles found himself watching Camilla with new eyes, analyzing every gesture, every phone call, every unexplained absence. The knowledge he carried felt like a weight in his chest, making ordinary conversations feel like elaborate performances where both actors knew the script was fundamentally flawed. Camilla, for her part, seemed to sense that something had shifted. She was more attentive than usual, more careful with her words and actions. Her phone calls became even more secretive, often taken in the garden or during her morning walks. Charles noticed she had started taking longer showers, and he couldn't help but wonder if she was using the time to make private calls where the sound of running water would mask her voice. The first real test came 3 days after the breakfast incident. Charles was in his study, ostensibly reviewing documents for an upcoming royal tour, but actually staring blankly at the papers while his mind churned through the implications of what he had discovered. The sound of Camilla's laughter drifted through the open window, and something about its quality, intimate, delighted, completely unguarded, made him look up sharply. Through the window, he could see her in the rose garden, walking among the beds they had planned together years ago. She was on her phone, and even from a distance, Charles could see the animation in her posture. She gestured with her free hand as she spoke, occasionally stopping to smell a rose or adjust a wayward bloom, all while maintaining what was clearly an absorbing conversation. Unable to stop himself, Charles moved closer to the window. He told himself he was just checking on the garden, admiring the roses that were coming into their full summer glory. But, truthfully, he was trying to catch fragments of Camilla's conversation, hoping to understand the scope of what he was dealing with. "Can't wait for Thursday," he heard her say as a breeze carried her voice toward the house. I've already told Charles the First have that literacy board meeting in London. He never questions my charity commitments. Bless him. Sometimes I think he's relieved when I'm busy with my own things. Charles felt as if he'd been struck. The casual way she spoke about deceiving him, the affectionate tone mixed with practical deception, was somehow more painful than the original discovery. It wasn't just that she was having an affair, it was that she had become comfortable with lying to him, had developed systems and strategies for maintaining her double life. He watched as she moved deeper into the garden, her voice fading until he could no longer make out individual words. But the body language remained clear. This was a woman in love, energized by connection, glowing with the kind of happiness that comes from being truly seen and appreciated by another person. Charles retreated from the window and slumped into his desk chair, feeling suddenly old and tired. When had he stopped being the person who could inspire that kind of joy in Camilla? When had their marriage become something she needed to escape from rather than cherish? The irony was bitter. For decades, he had endured public criticism and personal sacrifice for the chance to be with Camilla. He had weathered the storms of his first marriage ending, the tragedy of Diana's death, the years of public disapproval, all for the promise of finally being with the woman who truly understood him. And now, having achieved that goal, he was discovering that understanding and passion were not the same thing. That evening, over dinner, Charles found himself studying Camilla with forensic attention. She was telling him about her day, a mixture of truth and lies that he could now partially decode. The literacy board meeting she mentioned was real, he knew, because he had seen it in her official diary. But her enthusiasm for the project felt performative, as if she were using genuine work commitments to add authenticity to her deception. The reading program is really taking shape, she said, cutting into her salmon with precise movements. We're hoping to reach over 1,000 children in the first year. The volunteers are so dedicated. It's inspiring to see people give their time so generously. Charles nodded, making appropriate responses while watching for tells. Camilla was an accomplished public figure, experienced in maintaining composure under scrutiny, but he had known her for decades. He could see the slight tension around her eyes, the way she was being more deliberate than usual about maintaining eye contact. Will you need to spend much time in London for the program? He asked casually, though the question felt loaded with significance. Some yes. Probably once or twice a week for the next few months while we get everything established. Nothing too demanding, but you know how these things require hands-on attention during the startup phase. Charles felt another piece click into place. Once or twice a week in London would provide perfect cover for regular meetings with her lover. The genius of it was that the literacy program was genuine. If anyone questioned her whereabouts or checked her schedule, the official appointments would verify her story. It was the private time around those appointments that would be unaccounted for. After dinner, they retired to the library for their customary evening tea. This ritual had always been sacred to them, a time for honest conversation and intimate connection. Now it felt like a minefield where every topic was potentially dangerous. Camilla seemed restless, checking her phone more frequently than usual. When it buzzed with an incoming message, Charles watched her face transform, just for a moment, with unmistakable delight before she composed herself and set the device aside without reading the message. Aren't you going to check that? Charles asked, testing. Oh, it's probably just the office confirming tomorrow's schedule, she replied airily. Nothing that can't wait until morning. But Charles noticed how her eyes kept drifting to the phone throughout their conversation, how distracted she seemed despite her efforts to appear engaged. When she excused herself early, claiming fatigue, he knew she was going to find privacy to read and respond to what was clearly an important message. Alone in the library, Charles poured himself another cup of tea and tried to process what his life had become. He was living with someone who was fundamentally dishonest with him, someone who was putting considerable energy into maintaining elaborate deceptions. The woman he had loved for decades was still there, but she was performing their marriage rather than living it. The next morning brought a new development. Charles was in the breakfast room when Camilla appeared, already dressed for London and glowing with an energy that seemed disproportionate to a charity board meeting. I may be late tonight, she announced, kissing his cheek with what felt like guilty affection. The board meeting might run long, and I promised to have dinner with Sarah afterward. You know how she worries about the children's reading scores in her district. I feel I should give her the time she needs. Sarah was indeed a genuine friend and fellow literacy advocate, which made the lie more sophisticated. Charles had no doubt that Camilla could arrange to see Sarah if questioned, But he suspected the real purpose of the evening was quite different. Of course, Charles replied, maintaining the pretense that held their life together. Give my regards to Sarah. After Camilla left, Charles found himself wandering through their home like a ghost. Everywhere he looked, he saw reminders of their shared life, photographs from official tours, gifts they had given each other, books they had read together. Each memento felt like evidence of something that might be ending, relics of a happiness that was perhaps already in the past. His private secretary arrived mid-morning with the day's correspondence and schedule. Michael had worked for Charles for over 15 years and knew him well enough to notice mood changes. Everything all right, sir? He asked delicately after reviewing several documents that Charles had signed without really reading. Fine, Michael. Just tired. Perhaps you could reschedule this afternoon's meetings? I find myself needing some time to think. Michael nodded and withdrew, but Charles caught the concerned look on his face. Even his staff was beginning to notice that something was wrong. How long before their problems became public knowledge? How long before the press caught wind of the situation? Charles spent the afternoon walking the grounds, trying to clear his head and decide what to do. The roses that Camilla tended so lovingly seemed to mock him with their beauty. The garden paths they had planned together felt like monuments to naivety. Everything in their shared space reminded him of better times and forced him to confront how much had changed. As evening approached, Charles found himself checking the clock repeatedly. Camilla had said she might be late, but how late? And what exactly would she be doing during those unaccounted hours? The uncertainty was almost worse than knowing. When she finally returned, well after 10 o'clock, she was radiant in a way that made Charles's heart ache. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright, and she moved with the light step of someone who had just experienced something wonderful. Sorry I'm so late, darling, she said, settling beside him on the sofa where he had been waiting with a book he hadn't really been reading. Sarah and I had the most productive conversation about the reading program. I completely lost track of time. You know how passionate she gets about education reform. Charles studied his wife's face, noting the careful way she maintained eye contact, the slight breathlessness in her voice that could be attributed to rushing home, but somehow felt like something else entirely. How is Sarah? He asked. Oh, wonderful. Busy with the children, of course, but so committed to making a difference. We talked for hours about funding strategies and volunteer recruitment. I think we've made some real breakthroughs. The lies came so easily to her now, woven seamlessly into conversations with enough truth to make them believable. Charles wondered how long this had been going on, how many evenings like this he had accepted without question. I'm glad the work is going well, he said, and meant it, even though he knew the work was only part of what was making Camilla so happy. That night, as they lay in bed, Charles listened to Camilla's breathing settle into the rhythm of sleep and wondered what she dreamed about. Did she dream of her lover? Did she feel guilty about the life she was living? Or had she found a way to compartmentalize so completely that she could sleep peacefully beside her husband while planning her next deception? The questions tormented him through the long hours of darkness. By morning, he had reached a decision. He needed to know the truth, all of it. The partial knowledge he possessed was driving him slowly mad. He needed facts, evidence, a complete picture of what he was dealing with before he could decide how to respond. Charles had never imagined himself in the position of investigating his own wife, but circumstances had forced his hand. The woman lying beside him, peaceful in sleep, was both the love of his life and a stranger who was systematically betraying him. The contradiction was unbearable, and resolution required information he didn't possess. As dawn broke over Highgrove, Charles made his choice. He would uncover the truth, whatever the cost. The alternative, living indefinitely in this suspended state of partial knowledge and growing suspicion, was simply impossible. Their marriage deserved either salvation or an honest ending, but it couldn't continue in its current form of elaborate pretense and careful lies. The decision brought him a measure of peace, even though he knew the path ahead would be painful. At least action was better than paralysis. At least seeking truth was better than accepting deception. Whatever happened next, it would be based on reality rather than the increasingly fragile illusion that currently held their life together. Charles had never been the type of man to spy on anyone, let alone his wife. The very idea went against his nature and upbringing. But, as he sat in his study the following morning, watching Camilla through the window as she made yet another animated phone call in the garden, he realized that his principles were being tested by circumstances he had never anticipated. The decision to seek concrete evidence didn't come easily. Charles spent the better part of the morning wrestling with the moral implications of what he was considering. Did he have the right to investigate Camilla's private communications? Was his suspicion justified, or was he allowing paranoia to poison their marriage? But every time he wavered, he remembered the conversation he had overheard, the casual way she had discussed deceiving him, and his resolve strengthened. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Camilla announced over lunch that she had an emergency meeting in London that afternoon, another literacy crisis that required her immediate attention. Charles watched her gather her things with practiced efficiency, noting how she double-checked that her phone was fully charged and that she had her small overnight bag, just in case the meeting runs very late. "I may not be back until tomorrow morning," she said, kissing him goodbye with what seemed like genuine affection. "The funding committee is having some sort of crisis, and they've asked me to mediate. You know how these charity politics can be." Charles nodded and wished her well, playing his part in their elaborate charade. But as soon as her car disappeared down the drive, he felt his heart begin to race. For the first time in months, he would have unrestricted access to their shared spaces, to any evidence that might exist of Camilla's double life. He started with her study, the room where he had first noticed the suspicious phone calls. Charles felt like an intruder in the space that Camilla had made so distinctly her own. Family photographs smiled at him from every surface, including many of the two of them from happier times. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was searching for evidence of betrayal while surrounded by images of their love. Camilla's desk was meticulously organized, a reflection of her efficient approach to royal duties. Her official diary lay open, showing the day's entry. London Literacy Board meeting, 2 p.m. The appointment was real, which only confirmed how sophisticated her deceptions had become. By anchoring her lies in genuine commitments, she made them virtually undetectable. Charles went through her desk drawers carefully, replacing everything exactly as he found it. Most of what he discovered was innocuous: correspondence about various charities, shopping lists, notes about upcoming royal engagements. But in the bottom drawer, tucked beneath a stack of official papers, he found something that made his pulse quicken. It was a small appointment book, different from her official diary. This one was personal, written in Camilla's distinctive handwriting, and it contained entries that didn't appear in her public schedule. Tea with Jay appeared regularly, always on days when Camilla had mentioned charity work in London. Weekend retreat was noted for a weekend Charles remembered well. Camilla had told him she was visiting an old friend from school who was going through a difficult divorce. The entries were cryptic but clearly meaningful. Charles found his hands shaking as he photographed several pages with his phone, feeling simultaneously justified and guilty about the violation of privacy. But he needed evidence, and this appointment book was the first concrete proof that Camilla was maintaining a secret schedule. His search of the study yielded one more significant find: a credit card statement tucked away in a file marked personal expenses. Charles normally paid no attention to Camilla's spending. She was responsible with money and had every right to her independence. But now he scrutinized the charges with forensic attention. The pattern was telling. Regular charges at expensive restaurants in London, always on days when Camilla claimed to be in charity meetings. Hotel spa treatments, and boutique purchases that seemed designed to enhance her appearance for someone special. A particularly significant charge at a jewelry store, something Charles was certain he had never seen Camilla wear. The most damning entry was for a luxury hotel in Bath, charged for a weekend when Camilla had supposedly been visiting her sick friend. Charles remembered that weekend clearly because he had offered to accompany her, only to be told that her friend preferred a quiet visit with just Camilla. The hotel charge proved that story to be completely fabricated. Armed with this initial evidence, Charles moved to their bedroom, feeling increasingly like a detective investigating a case rather than a husband trying to understand his wife. Camilla's personal space felt foreign to him now, charged with secrets he was only beginning to uncover. In her jewelry box, behind the familiar pieces he had given her over the years, Charles found confirmation of his worst fears. There, nestled in a small velvet pouch, was an exquisite pendant necklace he had never seen before. The piece was clearly expensive, clearly chosen with intimate knowledge of Camilla's taste, and clearly not something she had bought for herself. The necklace was white gold with a small diamond, elegant, and understated in exactly the way Camilla preferred. But what made Charles's stomach clench was the engraving on the back: "To my darling C, with all my love, Jay." The same Jay who appeared regularly in Camilla's secret appointment book. Charles stood in their bedroom, holding evidence of his wife's affair, feeling as though the floor had given way beneath him. The necklace represented everything he feared. Another man who knew Camilla well enough to choose perfect gifts, who felt comfortable using endearments, who was important enough to her that she kept his gifts hidden but treasured. The sound of a car in the driveway sent panic through Charles's system. Had Camilla returned early? He quickly replaced the necklace and rushed to the window, only to see the groundskeeper arriving for his weekly maintenance. The false alarm left Charles shaking, fully aware of how guilty his behavior had become. But he couldn't stop now. The evidence he had found demanded a complete investigation. Charles needed to understand the full scope of Camilla's deception before deciding how to confront it. Half-truths and partial evidence would only make an eventual confrontation more difficult. Charles spent the rest of the afternoon carefully documenting what he had found. He photographed the appointment book entries, noting the correlation between T with J and Camilla's claimed charity meetings. He recorded the suspicious credit card charges, building a timeline of deception that stretched back nearly a year. The realization that the affair had been going on so long hit him like a physical blow. As evening approached, Charles found himself in the peculiar position of hoping his wife's lies would prove accurate, that she really would stay overnight in London rather than return home. He needed time to process what he had discovered, to plan his next steps without having to maintain the pretense of normalcy. His wish was granted. Camilla called around 7 o'clock to say that the committee meeting had indeed run late, and that she would be staying in London overnight. The casualness of her deception, the way she could lie so smoothly while Charles sat surrounded by evidence of her betrayal, was almost more painful than the original discovery. "I'm sorry to abandon you for the evening," she said, and Charles could hear ambient noise in the background, not the quiet of a meeting room, but the bustling sounds of a restaurant or bar. "These literacy people take their work very seriously. I think we'll be here for hours yet." "Don't worry about me," Charles replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "Take whatever time you need. The work is important." After hanging up, Charles poured himself a substantial whiskey and tried to make sense of his situation. He was married to someone who could lie effortlessly to his face while apparently enjoying an evening with her lover. The Camilla he thought he knew, honest, direct, incapable of sustained deception, had been revealed as either a fiction or a persona that no longer existed. The next morning brought a new revelation. Charles was in the kitchen early, unable to sleep and seeking the comfort of routine, when he heard Camilla's car in the driveway. Through the window, he watched her emerge from the vehicle, and what he saw made his breath catch. She was glowing. There was no other word for it. Despite supposedly spending the evening in tedious committee meetings, Camilla looked radiant, energized, and thoroughly content. Her clothes, while appropriate for charity work, seemed somehow more polished than usual. Her hair had been recently styled, and she moved with the satisfied grace of a woman who had been thoroughly appreciated. "Good morning, darling," she said breezily as she entered the kitchen. "Sorry I'm so early, but the meeting wrapped up much sooner than expected this morning. I thought I might as well come home and start the day properly." Charles studied her face, noting the faint evidence of careful makeup application and the way she avoided sustained eye contact. "How did the funding crisis resolve?" "Oh, wonderfully. Much ado about nothing, really, but you know how these charity boards can dramatize things. A few conversations and some strategic compromises, and everyone was happy." She moved around the kitchen with unusual energy, preparing coffee and organizing her bag for the day ahead. "I'm glad it worked out," Charles said, each word carefully neutral. He watched as she checked her phone, smiled at something she read, and quickly typed a response before putting the device away. The casual nature of her deception, the way she could look him in the eye while describing a completely fictional version of her evening, was perhaps the most devastating part of the entire situation. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a single mistake. This was a systematic lifestyle built on lies. As the morning progressed, Charles found himself cataloging every small dishonesty. The way Camilla mentioned being tired after her difficult evening, while clearly being energized. The story about the early meeting resolution when she had obviously spent the night elsewhere. The careful way she mentioned needing to follow up on committee decisions that would likely require more trips to London. By noon, Charles had reached a breaking point. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern clear, and the continued deception unbearable. He had spent months living in suspicion and the last 24 hours confirming his worst fears. The time had come for honesty, whatever the consequences. But first, he needed one final piece of evidence, something that would make denial impossible and force a complete reckoning. Charles realized that Camilla's phone, which she guarded so carefully, would contain the definitive proof of her affair. If he could access her messages, he would have undeniable evidence of the relationship with Jay. The opportunity came that afternoon. Camilla was in the garden, meeting with their head groundskeeper about the autumn plantings. From his study window, Charles could see her gesturing animatedly as they discussed rose varieties and border plantings. Her phone lay forgotten on the garden table, temporarily abandoned in her enthusiasm for the horticultural discussion. Charles moved quickly but carefully. He had seen Camilla enter her passcode enough times to know the combination. Their wedding anniversary, touchingly. The irony of using their marriage date to access evidence of her affair wasn't lost on him. The phone opened easily, and Charles navigated to her messages. What he found there exceeded even his worst expectations. The conversation thread with James contained months of intimate exchanges, passionate declarations, and detailed planning for their secret meetings. The messages painted a picture of a complete emotional and physical relationship. James clearly adored Camilla, writing long passages about her beauty, her intelligence, and his gratitude for her presence in his life. Camilla's responses were equally passionate, filled with endearments and expressions of love that Charles hadn't heard directed toward himself in years. Most painful were the messages about their future together. James regularly mentioned his divorce proceeding and his hopes for a life with Camilla once they were both free. Camilla's responses suggested she was seriously considering leaving Charles, though she worried about the public implications and the impact on royal duties. One message from the previous evening confirmed Charles's suspicions about her overnight stay. "Last night was perfect. I never want to leave your arms. Only a few more hours until I have to go back to pretending." Camilla's response was equally damning. "Being with you feels like coming home. Everything else is just performance now." Charles photographed several key message exchanges, his hands trembling as he captured evidence that would end his marriage. The casual way they discussed deceiving him, the detailed planning of their secret life, the obvious depth of their emotional connection, all of it was preserved in digital form, undeniable and devastating. As he heard footsteps approaching from the garden, Charles quickly closed the phone and replaced it exactly where Camilla had left it. When she entered the study moments later, he was sitting at his desk, ostensibly reviewing correspondence, though his heart was pounding so hard he was sure she must notice. "The garden is going to be spectacular this autumn," she said, settling into her favorite chair with a satisfied sigh. "Sometimes I think the planning is almost as enjoyable as the actual blooming." Charles looked up at his wife, beautiful, accomplished, and completely dishonest with him, and realized their marriage was over. The evidence on her phone had removed any possibility of misunderstanding or reconciliation. She was in love with another man, planning a life with him, and simply waiting for the right moment to make the transition. The only question now was how to end things with dignity. Charles had the evidence he needed for confrontation, but he also had to consider the public implications of their separation. They weren't just a married couple. They were public figures whose private problems would become national news. As Camilla chatted about garden plans and upcoming royal engagements, Charles found himself studying her with new eyes. Soon, these casual conversations would be memories. Soon, the woman who had been his companion for decades would become his ex-wife. The realization was both heartbreaking and oddly liberating. The masquerade was almost over. All that remained was deciding how and when to force the truth into the open. The decision of when and how to confront Camilla tormented Charles for 3 more days. Armed with undeniable evidence of her affair, he found himself in the strange position of having too much power and too little clarity about how to use it. The messages on her phone had removed all doubt about her betrayal, but they had also revealed the depth of her emotional investment in James, making the eventual confrontation even more consequential. Charles spent those days observing his wife with forensic attention, noting every lie, every evasion, every moment of distraction when her thoughts clearly wandered to her lover. The accumulated weight of deception was staggering. Camilla had constructed an elaborate alternative life, complete with fictional charity meetings, imaginary friends in crisis, and carefully choreographed absences that allowed for regular rendezvous with James. What struck Charles most forcefully was how comfortable she had become with the lies. There was no visible guilt, no apparent struggle with conscience. When she kissed him goodbye before her literacy committee meetings, her affection seemed genuine, as if she had successfully compartmentalized their marriage into something separate from her passionate affair. The emotional sophistication required for such sustained deception was almost impressive, if it weren't so devastating. The breaking point came on a Friday morning when Camilla announced yet another urgent trip to London. This time, the excuse was a crisis with the reading program volunteers. Several had apparently quit without notice, requiring immediate intervention to save an upcoming literacy event for disadvantaged children. "It's such a shame," she said over breakfast, her performance flawless as always. "These volunteers put in months of training, and then they simply walk away when things get challenging. The children are the ones who suffer, of course." Charles watched her weave concern for fictional children into her lie, using his own sympathy for charitable causes as camouflage for her deception. The cynicism of it, the way she weaponized his good nature against him, finally pushed him past the point of tolerance. "When do you think you'll be back?" he asked, though he already knew the answer would be vague and probably false. "I'm not sure, honestly. This might require the entire weekend to sort out properly. I may need to stay over Saturday night if we can't find replacement volunteers quickly enough." She paused to sip her coffee, maintaining perfect eye contact. "I know it's inconvenient, but the event is next week, and we simply can't let those children down." Charles nodded and made understanding noises while internally marveling at the elaborate construction of her deception. She had built in flexibility for an extended romantic weekend, while anchoring the lie in laudable concern for children's education. If questioned later, she could undoubtedly produce evidence of her charitable work while omitting the personal activities that occupied most of her time. After Camilla left for London, Charles made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. He would not wait for her return to demand answers. Instead, he would go to London himself and confront the situation directly. The elaborate dance of lies and suspicion had gone on long enough. If Camilla wanted to live a double life, she could do it without his unwitting cooperation. Charles instructed his driver to prepare for a trip to London, then called his private secretary to cancel his weekend engagements. Michael's surprised reaction to the sudden change in plans confirmed how unusual Charles's behavior had become. For months, he had been the model of predictable routine, making the sudden decision to pursue his wife particularly striking. "Is everything all right, sir?" Michael asked carefully. "This isn't like you to change plans so suddenly." "Everything's fine," Charles replied, though nothing could have been further from the truth. "I've simply decided to surprise Camilla in London. I thought I might take her to dinner after her committee meeting." The lie came easily, which disturbed Charles more than he cared to admit. Apparently, sustained exposure to deception was contagious. He was becoming someone he didn't recognize, someone who could mislead his loyal staff in service of confronting his unfaithful wife. The drive to London gave Charles time to plan his approach. He had Camilla's secret appointment book with him, along with photographs of the incriminating text messages. The evidence was overwhelming, but he still needed to decide how to use it. A direct confrontation would be satisfying, but might also be unnecessarily destructive. Perhaps there was still a chance for honest conversation, for understanding how they had reached this point. By the time Charles reached London, however, his resolve for a measured approach was wavering. The anger that he had been suppressing for weeks was finally breaking through his careful composure. The sheer audacity of Camilla's deception, the way she had systematically lied to him while maintaining the pretense of a loving marriage, demanded a response proportional to the betrayal. Charles directed his driver to the hotel, where Camilla's credit card records showed she regularly met James. The Savoy, their choice revealed both sophisticated taste and a cruel irony, as it was the same hotel where Charles and Camilla had celebrated their engagement years earlier. The fact that she was conducting her affair in a place with such personal significance felt like a deliberate insult. The hotel staff recognized Charles immediately, though they tried to maintain professional discretion. When he inquired about Mrs. Parker Bowles, Camilla still used her previous name for personal business. The desk clerk consulted the computer with obvious discomfort. "I believe Mrs. Parker Bowles is registered with us, sir," the clerk said carefully. "Would you like me to ring her room?" "No, thank you. I'll surprise her," Charles replied, accepting the room number with a calm that belied the storm building inside him. The elevator ride to the 7th floor felt endless. Charles found himself rehearsing possible opening lines, trying to prepare for a conversation that would inevitably be unlike any they had ever had. How do you confront the person you love most with evidence of their systematic betrayal? How do you demand honesty from someone who has become an expert in deception? Room 717 was at the end of a quiet corridor. Charles stood outside the door for a long moment, listening to the sound of voices and laughter from within. Camilla's distinctive laugh rang out clearly, followed by a man's deeper voice saying something that prompted another burst of delighted laughter. The sound of his wife's happiness with another man was almost unbearable. Charles raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. Once he knocked on that door, everything would change irrevocably. Their marriage, their public image, their shared life, all of it would be thrown into chaos. There would be no going back to the comfortable lies and careful distance that had characterized their relationship for months. But the alternative, continuing to live as an unknowing participant in Camilla's elaborate deception, was impossible. Charles knocked firmly on the door, 3 sharp raps that echoed down the corridor. The voices inside stopped abruptly. Charles could imagine the panic on the other side of the door, the desperate scrambling to make sense of an unexpected visitor. After a moment, Camilla's voice called out, carefully controlled but with an underlying note of tension. "Just a moment, please." Charles heard rapid movement, hushed conversation, and what sounded like someone gathering clothes hastily. The domestic sounds of people trying to make themselves presentable painted a clear picture of what he had interrupted. When the door finally opened, Camilla stood before him in a hotel bathrobe, her hair disheveled and her face flushed. Behind her, Charles could see a man's suit jacket draped over a chair and 2 wine glasses on the room service table. The scene required no interpretation. "Charles," Camilla said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" "I might ask you the same question," Charles replied quietly, "though I think the answer is fairly obvious." For a moment, they simply stared at each other, husband and wife, betrayer and betrayed, 2 people whose long-shared history had led to this moment of absolute honesty. Charles could see the calculations running behind Camilla's eyes, the desperate search for an explanation that might salvage the situation. "The literacy meeting ended early," she began, but Charles cut her off with a raised hand. "Please don't," he said simply. "We're past that now." From inside the room, Charles heard movement and saw a man emerge from what was presumably the bathroom. James was tall, distinguished, and clearly uncomfortable with the sudden intrusion. He had hastily dressed in slacks and a shirt, but his appearance still suggested recent intimacy. "I should go," James said quietly, moving toward his jacket. "No," Charles said firmly. "Stay? I think it's time we all had an honest conversation." The 3 of them stood in awkward tableau for a moment, the husband, the wife, and the lover, brought together by chance and deception. Charles felt strangely calm now that the moment of truth had finally arrived. The weeks of suspicion and investigation had led to this confrontation, and there was something liberating about having the truth finally in the open. "Perhaps we should sit down," Charles suggested, though the suggestion felt surreal. How did one conduct a civilized conversation under such circumstances? Camilla moved aside to let him enter the room, and Charles found himself in the space where his wife had been conducting her affair. The evidence was everywhere. 2 sets of personal items in the bathroom, intimate photographs on the bedside table, the general atmosphere of a couple comfortable in shared space. "Charles, I can explain," Camilla began, but again he stopped her. "I don't think you can, actually," he said, settling into one of the room's chairs. "At least, not in any way that changes what's happening here. But I would like to understand how we reached this point." James remained standing near the door, clearly torn between flight and the recognition that running away would only make the situation worse. Charles studied the man who had won his wife's heart, trying to understand what Camilla saw in him. He was handsome in a conventional way, probably around 50, with the bearing of someone accustomed to success and attention. "How long has this been going on?" Charles asked, directing the question to both of them. Camilla and James exchanged a look that spoke of intimate communication, the kind of wordless understanding that Charles remembered sharing with his wife in better times. "About 10 months, Camilla said finally, her voice barely audible. 10 months. Charles absorbed the timeline, thinking about all the charity meetings and emergency board sessions that had covered their affair. 10 months of systematic deception, 10 months of passionate messages and secret weekends, 10 months of his wife living a completely separate emotional life. "And you intend to leave me for him," Charles continued, stating what he had learned from reading her phone rather than asking a question. This time, the look between Camilla and James was even more meaningful. Charles realized he was witnessing a conversation they had already had multiple times, seeing the evidence of plans already made. "Charles, this isn't how I wanted you to find out," Camilla said, finally, moving to sit across from him. "I've been trying to figure out how to tell you. how to make this as painless as possible for everyone involved. Painless, Charles repeated, tasting the word. I'm not sure that was ever going to be possible. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. Here they were, having the most honest conversation of their marriage in a hotel room where his wife had been betraying him. The truth had finally emerged, but only because he had forced the issue through investigation and confrontation. I never meant for this to happen, Camilla continued, her composure beginning to crack. I tried to resist it, tried to focus on our marriage, but you fell in love with someone else, Charles finished for her. Yes, she whispered, and in that single word, Charles heard both confession and liberation. The simple honesty of her admission was somehow less painful than the weeks of lies that had preceded it. At least now they were dealing with truth, however devastating it might be. Charles looked at James, who had been standing silently throughout this exchange. And you? What are your intentions? James straightened, meeting Charles's gaze directly. I love her, sir. I know the circumstances are complicated, but I want to marry her when she's ready. The formal politeness of the exchange felt absurd, but Charles appreciated the directness. At least James wasn't trying to minimize or excuse the situation. I see, Charles said quietly. He felt strangely empty, as if the confrontation he had anticipated for weeks was proving anticlimactic. The truth was out, the deception was over, but he felt more numb than angry. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, each processing the implications of the conversation. Charles realized that this was likely the end of his marriage, the conclusion of a relationship that had spanned decades and survived incredible public scrutiny, only to fall victim to the simple human reality of changing hearts. What happens now? He asked finally, the question directed at both of them, but really addressed to his wife. Camilla looked at James again, drawing strength from his presence before turning back to Charles. I want a divorce, she said simply. I want to be free to marry James and build a life with him. Charles nodded slowly, absorbing the finality of her statement. After weeks of investigation and suspicion, after the elaborate charade of their dying marriage, it all came down to this simple declaration in a London hotel room. Then, that's what we'll do, he replied, surprising himself with his calm acceptance. We'll need to discuss the details, of course, and consider the public implications. But if that's what you want, then we'll make it happen. The conversation that followed was surreal in its practicality. They discussed timing, logistics, and public relations strategies for ending one of the most scrutinized marriages in the world. It felt like a business meeting focused on the dissolution of their shared life. As Charles finally prepared to leave the hotel room, he turned back to look at Camilla one last time. She was sitting beside James now, their hands intertwined, looking like any couple planning their future together. The sight should have been heartbreaking, but Charles found himself feeling mostly relief that the pretense was finally over. I hope you'll be happy, he said, and meant it despite everything. I hope you will be too, Camilla replied, tears finally beginning to fall down her cheeks. Charles left the hotel knowing that his marriage was over, but also knowing that they had finally found their way back to honesty with each other. It was a strange comfort, but comfort nonetheless. The months following the confrontation at the Savoy moved with the strange combination of urgency and deliberate pace that characterized royal crises. Charles and Camilla's divorce proceedings had to be conducted with unprecedented discretion, balancing personal devastation with public responsibility. The machinery of palace communications, legal teams, and media management clicked into action, transforming private heartbreak into carefully managed public narrative. Charles found himself living a peculiar double life during this period. Publicly, he and Camilla maintained the appearance of a functioning marriage while their lawyers negotiated the terms of its dissolution. They attended scheduled royal engagements together, smiled for photographers, and delivered speeches about various charitable causes, all while knowing that each appearance might be among their last as a married couple. The strain of maintaining this facade was enormous. Charles discovered that he was no better at sustained deception than he had imagined, even when the deception served legitimate purposes. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now lying as systematically as Camilla had during her affair, though his lies were meant to protect royal institutions rather than conceal personal betrayal. Their conversations at home became stilted and formal, focused entirely on practical matters. They discussed which belongings Camilla would take, how to divide their shared charitable commitments, and the timing of various announcements. The easy intimacy that had once characterized their relationship had evaporated completely, replaced by the careful politeness of two people managing a difficult business transaction. Camilla had moved into the guest wing of Highgrove, ostensibly to give them both space to process the situation, but really to begin the physical separation that would soon become permanent. Charles would sometimes glimpse her in the gardens, tending to roses they had planted together, and feel a sharp pang of loss that surprised him with its intensity. Despite everything that had happened, despite her betrayal and their mutual decision to divorce, she was still the woman he had loved for most of his adult life. The legal aspects of their divorce proved surprisingly straightforward. Unlike Charles's first marriage, which had been complicated by custody issues and public sympathy for Diana, this divorce involved two mature adults with independent means and no minor children. Both Charles and Camilla wanted the process to be as quick and quiet as possible, which simplified negotiations considerably. The financial settlement was generous, but not excessive. Camilla would retain her titles and receive a substantial annual income, but she would relinquish any claim to royal properties or heirlooms. Most importantly for Charles, she agreed to a comprehensive confidentiality agreement that would prevent her from ever publicly discussing their marriage or its breakdown. The last thing either of them wanted was a tell-all book or interview that would rehash their personal problems for public consumption. James Morrison, Charles had learned his surname through the divorce proceedings, proved to be a successful investment banker with his own considerable wealth. The revelation that Camilla's lover was financially independent removed one potential complication from the divorce negotiations. There would be no accusations of gold digging or fortune hunting, no suggestions that Camilla had left her royal marriage for purely mercenary reasons. The most challenging aspect of the entire process was managing public perception. Charles's communications team worked tirelessly to craft a narrative that would minimize damage to the monarchy while allowing both parties to maintain their dignity. The official statement, when it finally came, would cite irreconcilable differences and emphasize the couple's continued mutual respect and shared commitment to their charitable work. Behind the carefully crafted public statements, however, Charles was struggling with profound personal questions about his judgment, his future, and his ability to maintain meaningful relationships. This was his second failed marriage, his second very public romantic failure, and the pattern was beginning to feel like a character flaw rather than bad luck. His sons, William and Harry, provided unexpected support during this difficult period. Both men had lived through their parents' acrimonious divorce and understood the unique pressures of ending a marriage under intense public scrutiny. Their advice was practical and compassionate. Focus on maintaining dignity, protect the institution of the monarchy, and don't let personal failure define his legacy. You can't control what people think about your private life, William told his father during a particularly difficult conversation. But you can control how you handle yourself during the crisis. Grace under pressure. That's what people remember. The wisdom in his son's words wasn't lost on Charles. William had learned hard lessons about public life from watching his parents' marriage implode in the most public way possible. His guidance came from painful experience and genuine concern for his father's well-being. As the summer progressed, Charles found himself rediscovering aspects of his personality that had been dormant during the troubled final years of his marriage. Without the constant undercurrent of suspicion and deception that had characterized his relationship with Camilla, he felt lighter, more optimistic about possibilities for happiness. His work took on new energy and focus. Environmental initiatives that had been languishing received renewed attention. Architectural projects that had been delayed were revitalized with fresh enthusiasm. Charles threw himself into his royal duties with a passion that his staff hadn't seen in years, as if channeling his emotional turmoil into productive activity. The announcement of the divorce came in September, delivered through the traditional palace channels with maximum dignity and minimum detail. The statement emphasized the couple's continued friendship and their shared commitment to their various charitable endeavors. No specific reasons were given for the separation, and both parties were described as supporting the decision. Public reaction was surprisingly muted. Perhaps the British people had simply grown tired of royal romantic drama, or perhaps Charles's age and circumstances generated more sympathy than scandal. The tabloid press certainly covered the story extensively, but without the viciousness that had characterized coverage of his first divorce. There was a general sense that this was a private matter between two adults who had tried to make their relationship work, but ultimately failed. Camilla's departure from royal life was handled with similar discretion. She retained some of her charitable patronages, particularly those related to literacy and domestic violence prevention, but stepped back from all official royal duties. The transition was so smooth that many casual observers didn't immediately realize the significance of her absence from public events. The actual divorce was finalized on a gray October morning in a London courtroom, with minimal fanfare and maximum security. Charles and Camilla appeared together one final time, sitting at opposite ends of the same table while lawyers handled the procedural requirements. They barely spoke to each other, but when their eyes met briefly as they signed the final papers, Charles saw a mixture of sadness and relief that probably mirrored his own expression. Walking out of the courthouse as officially divorced individuals felt surreal. Charles had expected to feel either elated or devastated, but instead he felt simply empty, as if a significant chapter of his life had ended without any clear sense of what the next chapter might contain. The practical aspects of separation continued for several more weeks. Camilla's belongings were packed and removed from Highgrove with the same efficiency that had characterized their entire divorce process. Charles found himself wandering through rooms that had been stripped of her personal touches, amazed at how quickly a shared life could be dismantled and divided. Some losses were more significant than others. The garden, which they had planned and tended together, felt particularly bereft without Camilla's regular attention. Charles hired additional gardening staff to maintain the roses and borders they had created, but the space would always remind him of better times when they had worked side by side, planning for a future that no longer existed. By Christmas, Charles had established new routines that reflected his changed circumstances. He spent more time with his sons and their families, traveled more frequently for official engagements, and began accepting social invitations that he had declined during the difficult final years of his marriage. Friends who had been diplomatically distant during the crisis began reaching out, offering support and companionship. The holidays were particularly challenging, filled with reminders of previous years when he and Camilla had hosted family gatherings and exchanged gifts with the easy intimacy of a long-established couple. But Charles was surprised to discover that solitude, while sometimes lonely, also offered opportunities for reflection and growth that hadn't been possible during years of marital tension. In January, nearly 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Charles received an unexpected phone call from Camilla. Her voice on the phone was warm but careful, lacking the easy familiarity that had once characterized their conversations. "I wanted you to know that James and I are engaged," she said simply. "I thought you should hear it from me before it appears in the papers." Charles absorbed the news with equanimity. He had expected this development, and enough time had passed that it no longer felt like a personal blow. "Congratulations," he said, and meant it. "I hope you'll be very happy together." "Thank you," Camilla replied. "That means more to me than you might realize." They talked for a few more minutes about practical matters, adjustments to their financial agreement, coordination of their remaining shared charitable commitments, and the timing of the engagement announcement. The conversation was polite and businesslike, but not unfriendly. They had found their way to a kind of post-marriage relationship that honored their shared history while acknowledging their separate futures. After hanging up, Charles realized that he felt genuinely happy for Camilla. The anger and hurt that had dominated his feelings for months had evolved into something more like acceptance and even goodwill. She had found what she was looking for, and perhaps that freed him to do the same. Spring brought unexpected developments in Charles's own romantic life. At a charity gala, he was introduced to Dr. Sarah Matthews, a distinguished art historian who shared his passion for architectural preservation. Their conversation was engaging and intellectually stimulating, touching on subjects that had always been important to Charles, but that Camilla had never shown much interest in. Sarah was attractive in an understated way, with an intelligence and independence that Charles found appealing. She was divorced herself, with grown children, and had no apparent interest in royal titles or public attention. Their subsequent conversations, conducted over private dinners and walks through historic sites, felt refreshingly honest and uncomplicated. "I appreciate that you're interested in me as a person rather than as a title," Charles told her during one of their early dates. "That's rarer than you might imagine in my position. I'm far too old and set in my ways to be impressed by titles," Sarah replied with a smile. "Though I admit your knowledge of Gothic architecture is quite impressive." The relationship developed slowly and naturally, without the intense drama that had characterized Charles's previous romantic entanglements. There were no secret phone calls or mysterious absences, no elaborate deceptions or painful discoveries. Instead, there was simply the gradual building of friendship and affection between two people who enjoyed each other's company. By the time Camilla's wedding to James was announced for the following autumn, Charles was able to send genuine congratulations and even a thoughtful wedding gift, a rare book about garden design that acknowledged their shared love of horticulture while marking the end of that chapter of their lives. The wedding itself was a private affair, attended by close friends and family, but generating minimal media attention. Charles spent that weekend with Sarah, visiting National Trust properties in the Cotswolds and discussing plans for an upcoming royal tour focused on historic preservation. The contrast between his current contentment and his previous romantic turmoil was remarkable. As Charles looked back on the events that had transformed his life, the discovery of Camilla's affair, the painful confrontation, the difficult divorce process, and his eventual emergence into new happiness, he realized that personal catastrophes could sometimes lead to unexpected benefits. The end of his marriage to Camilla had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and his relationships, but it had also freed him to pursue connections based on genuine compatibility rather than romantic history. Camilla's secret phone calls and mysterious absences had seemed like the end of the world when Charles first discovered them. But, in the end, they had been the beginning of a new chapter, one characterized by honesty, mutual respect, and the possibility of authentic happiness. Sometimes the most devastating discoveries turned out to be unexpected gifts, pointing the way toward better futures that couldn't be imagined while trapped in deteriorating circumstances. The roses at Highgrove bloomed as beautifully as ever that summer, tended now by professional gardeners, but still appreciated by Charles during his solitary morning walks. The garden remained a reminder of his time with Camilla, but it no longer felt like a monument to loss. Instead, it had become a testament to the possibility of growth and renewal, proof that even the most carefully planned landscapes could be redesigned when circumstances required new approaches. Charles's story had found its way to a surprisingly hopeful conclusion, though the path had been more difficult than anyone could have anticipated when it began with the simple sound of a breakfast tray crashing to the floor on an ordinary Tuesday morning.